You know, usually when we think about ancient history, there's this underlying expectation of distance.
Right, like a massive buffer zone.
Exactly. Like we're dealing with mythology or something. You look at an ancient text, maybe, something written a couple thousand years ago, and the modern historian just kind of points at it from a safe distance and says, well, it's mostly legend.
Yeah, they treat it like a nice story, but one that's just, lost to the fog of time.
Right. And we tend to treat myth and history as this very clean binary choice. And honestly, I think that's comforting.
Oh, absolutely. It's very safe.
Yeah, we like our ancient stories to sit neatly in an unverifiable legend box, right? Because it means we don't have to grapple with them too closely.
We can just appreciate them as literature, and move on with our day.
Exactly. But then you step into the world of first century texts. Specifically, we're talking about the Christian Gospels today. And suddenly that neat little box it's blown wide open.
It really is.
Because we are looking at a historical landscape that is startlingly precise.
Yeah, it's the absolute definition of a historical puzzle that just refuses to be easily categorized.
Right.
And because of that precision, it demands a much closer, highly critical look from you, the listener. And I should say up front, we aren't taking a theological approach here today.
No, not at all.
We are putting religious doctrine and, faith-based arguments completely to the side.
Yeah.
We have to establish a strict secular standard of evidence.
The exact same standard a historian applies when they're evaluating the political speeches of Cicero
Right.
or the histories by Tacitus.
Precisely that. When a document claims to be a literal historical record, which, by the way, these texts explicitly do, you don't just look at the big sweeping narrative arcs.
You look for the granular stuff.
Yes, the mundane background noise. You look for obscure geographical elevations, incredibly localized regional dialects.
The shifting titles of political rulers.
Exactly. And the routine, everyday prejudices of the common people. Because if a document is an authentic product of its specific time and place, it's going to bear the unmistakable fingerprints of that era.
But if it's a forgery...
Right. If it's historical fiction written by someone sitting in a totally different country, maybe a century later, they are inevitably going to get those subtle textures completely wrong.
Because they don't have Wikipedia, they don't have Google Earth.
They don't even have standardized encyclopedias. I mean, the sheer logistics of researching foreign political and geographical trivia in the ancient world were staggeringly difficult.
So essentially, if we're going to put these documents on trial, the first hurdle is just grounding them in time and space.
Right. Before we even look at the extraordinary things the texts claim actually happened, we have to test if the writers actually possessed authentic knowledge of the physical and political world they were claiming to write about.
And we're going to look at the cumulative case built on 8 interlocking premises today, from geography all the way to personality profiling.
And we'll be tackling the biggest skeptical objections head-on as they come up.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the political landscape of the Middle East in the first century was chaotic. We aren't talking about like clean, stable national borders here.
Oh, not at all. The Roman Empire's control in the East was a massive, constantly shifting patchwork.
Yeah, client kings, local governors, prefects, tetrarchs. Which brings me to this passage in the Gospel of Luke. It's chapter 3, verses 1 and 2.
A classic.
When I was looking through our sources for this deep dive, this just jumped out at me as practically a nightmare scenario for a potential forger.
No, it's incredibly risky.
Right. Luke is setting the stage for John the Baptist's ministry, and he doesn't open with, once upon a time in a land far away. He decides to synchronize his story with the exact political landscape of the moment.
And he names 7 different rulers simultaneously.
7. He writes that it was the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea.
Yeah.
Herod was tetrarch of Galilee. His brother Philip was tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis.
Right.
Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. And Annas and Caiaphas were high priests.
It's just a wild amount of data to drop in one sentence.
It is. That's 7 overlapping political and religious figures with specific regional titles, all pinpointed to a single hyper-specific window of time in the late 20s AD.
To understand how risky that is for a writer, you have to look at the term tetrarch. It was a Roman administrative title that literally meant the ruler of a fourth part of a region.
Right?
But it was used, somewhat flexibly for minor provincial rulers.
Yeah.
The borders of these territories were constantly being redrawn by Rome.
Rulers were getting deposed, reassigned, killed.
Exactly. So to get the simultaneous overlap of all these officials in their correct territories, you had to possess intimate, localized knowledge. Luke couldn't just guess this stuff.
But, I mean, could he have just copied it from a history book? Like maybe he read the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote toward the end of the 1st century?
It's a common question, but we know he didn't. Because Luke includes specific geopolitical information that Josephus doesn't even have.
Really? Like,
Well, for instance, Josephus confirms that Philip ruled the region of Trachonitis. But Luke adds this super granular detail. He notes that Philip also ruled the region of Iturea.
oh, interesting.
Yeah, that tells the historian that Luke is operating as an independent source. He has his own access to the political realities on the ground.
But still, anytime you list 7 specific political figures, the statistical risk of making a fatal historical error is just astronomical.
Oh, and for a long time, critics thought they had caught Luke in a massive lie regarding one of those names.
Lysanias, right, the Tetrarch of Abilene.
Exactly. This was a major point of contention in 19th century biblical criticism.
Yeah.
Scholars looked at Luke's list and said, aha, we found the anachronism.
Because Josephus did mention a ruler named Lysanias who had control over Abilene.
Right. The problem was that particular Lysanias was executed by Mark Antony way back in 36 BC.
Which is decades before Jesus was even born.
Decades. So the academic consensus was just, well, Luke is a sloppy historian.
They thought he was trying to sound authoritative, looked up some old records, saw the name Lysanias associated with Abilene.
And just carelessly dragged a dead guy into the late 20s AD.
Yeah.
Yeah. They thought it was wildly implausible to have 2 different rulers with the exact same name ruling the exact same minor region nearly a century apart.
I mean, I kind of get why they'd think that. It sounds like a stretch.
It does, and that was the sneering consensus for quite a while. But then archaeology actually caught up with the text.
Okay, tell us about the Abila inscription, because I want to make sure you, the listener, grasp how crazy this is. What exactly is an inscription in this context?
Right, so it was a stone dedication. In the ancient world, when someone funded a building project, they would carve a dedication into stone, usually honoring the current emperor to show, political loyalty.
Sure.
This specific inscription in the Syrian region of Abila was written by a freedman, a formerly enslaved person who was dedicating a temple project, and he dedicated it on behalf of his patron.
And who was the patron?
He explicitly names him as Lysanias the Tetrarch.
Boom! But wait, how do we know it's not the older Lysanias from 36 BC?
Ah, because of the political titles used in the dedication. The freedman dedicates the building to the Augusti.
Augusti, plural.
Exactly, plural. In Roman history, the title Augustus was used, but the plural form, Augusti, specifically points to a time when there were 2 figures sharing that supreme honor.
Okay, so who were they?
We know with historical certainty that this refers to the Emperor Tiberius and his mother Livia, who was given the title Julia Augusta after the original Emperor Augustus died.
Wow.
So because of those specific imperial titles, historians can perfectly date this stone inscription to the reign of Tiberius, which is between 14 and 29 AD.
Which perfectly overlaps with the exact time frame Luke is writing about.
It completely upended the critical consensus. That stone proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was, in fact, a second tetrarch named Lysanias ruling Abilene exactly when Luke claimed there was.
That is wild. For centuries, academics were absolutely certain he was fabricating history.
And then the dust of an archaeological dig proved the text was flawlessly accurate.
And it isn't just the political maps they get right. They get the literal physical architecture of the cities right.
Oh, the architecture's fascinating.
Yeah, let's talk about the Gospel of John, chapter 5. Jesus heals a paralyzed man in Jerusalem at a place called the Pool of Bethesda. And John just casually drops a physical description of the site, noting that it has 5 porticos.
Right.
For anyone listening who isn't an architect, a portico is essentially a covered colonnade, like a porch with columns.
And again, we have to look at how modern critics initially reacted to that specific detail. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, there was this prominent French liberal critic named Alfred Loisy.
Okay.
He looked at this description of a pool with 5 porticos and concluded it was purely an invented allegorical detail.
Why would he assume it was an allegory instead of just, a building?
Because biologically and architecturally, a 5-sided structure is incredibly unusual.
That makes sense. Most ancient pools or public baths were rectangular, right? 4 sides. Or maybe circular.
Exactly. A pentagon-shaped pool didn't make much sense. So Loisy, sitting in a library in France, theorizes that the 5 porticos were a theological metaphor created by the author.
Like representing the 5 books of Moses or something.
Spot on. He argued the paralyzed man represented the Jewish people, and the 5 porticos represented the Torah. The theological argument was that the 5 books of the law couldn't heal the man, but Jesus could.
I have to admit, that sounds like a really elegant literary critique. Like if I'm taking a university literature class, I'm writing that essay and getting an A.
Oh, it makes brilliant literary sense. Right up until the moment archaeologists actually start digging near the Sheep Gate in the old city of Jerusalem.
Let me guess, they found it.
They found it. In the late 19th century, a German architect named Konrad Schick discovered the actual ruins of the Pool of Bethesda buried deep beneath the modern city. And later excavations in the 20th century fully mapped it out.
Okay, so what did the layout look like? Was it actually a pentagon?
It wasn't a pentagon. It was a massive rectangular twin pool.
A twin pool?
Yeah, it was 2 basins of water separated by a solid stone dividing wall right down the middle.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yep. It had 4 covered colonnades running around the outside perimeter and a 5th covered colonnade running straight across the dividing partition in the center.
Wow.
It was a literal physical structure with exactly 5 porticos.
Not a metaphor, just a guy describing what he actually saw.
Exactly.
And there is a massive ticking clock regarding these architectural details that we absolutely have to talk about. The destruction of Jerusalem.
This is perhaps the most vital dating mechanism historians have for these texts. In the year 70 AD, the Roman army, led by Titus, besieged Jerusalem.
And they absolutely leveled the city.
Leveled it. They burned the temple to the ground, destroyed the public works, and reduced the infrastructure to rubble. The Pool of Bethesda was completely buried.
So, if we follow the logic here, if an author is writing this gospel, say 80 or 100 years later, living hundreds of miles away in Ephesus or Rome, how do they know about the center dividing wall of a pool that hasn't existed for decades?
They don't. They can't.
Right?
That kind of casually accurate architectural detail, knowing the exact column layout of a destroyed municipal water feature, only comes from someone who had actually walked those streets and seen it with their own eyes before the Roman siege.
The author isn't looking up building schematics.
No, they are relying on authentic pre-70 AD visual memory.
And it just keeps happening. I mean, the sources mention the Pool of Siloam from John chapter 9. That site was completely lost to history until, what, 2004?
2004. A city crew was doing sewer maintenance in Jerusalem, dug in the wrong spot, and accidentally uncovered the ancient stone steps of the pool exactly where the gospel narrative placed it.
That's incredible. Or look at the topographical logic. The texts casually note that to go from the town of Cana down to Capernaum, you are literally going down. That sounds like a generic phrase, but Capernaum is on the Sea of Galilee, which sits about 700 feet below sea level. Cana is up in hill country. You are physically descending. It's just effortless geographical precision.
And notice the offhand nature of it. They drop the names of tiny obscure villages like Aenon near Salim or the town of Ephraim without feeling any need to explain them to the reader.
Yeah.
If you are a fabricator inventing a myth, you generally stick to famous, well-known locations, like Rome, Athens, Jerusalem, just to avoid getting caught in a geographical lie.
Or you just invent entirely fictional names to serve your narrative.
Exactly. You don't casually sprinkle your story with real, microscopic Judean farming villages and accurate topographical elevations just for atmospheric color.
Okay, wait, let me stop you right there because my brain is immediately going to modern fiction.
Okay, let's hear it.
I'm thinking about how I could write a thriller novel right now, and I could set it in London. I could pull up a map, accurately describe the distance from King's Cross Station to the River Thames, mention a real obscure pub down a side street.
Sure.
Just because I get the map of London right doesn't mean my fictional spy character is a real historical person.
Right.
Couldn't these gospel writers just be crafting a fictional narrative but choosing to set it in real cities they happen to know about?
That is one of the most common skeptical pushbacks. It's often called the Spider-Man objection.
The Spider-Man objection.
Yeah, it's just because the Spider-Man comic accurately draws the Empire State Building doesn't mean Peter Parker is swinging from it.
Ah, right, okay.
But the analogy breaks down when we look at the specific density and type of accuracy we are dealing with. First, we aren't just talking about a text stating Jesus went to Jerusalem. We are dealing with an overwhelming density of obscure, unrecoverable accuracy.
Right, because my hypothetical spy novelist has the internet.
Exactly. A first-century writer in Asia Minor trying to invent a Jewish backstory doesn't have a reference library to look up the distance in stadia between two destroyed Judean villages, or the exact layout of a demolished public pool.
So it's the sheer volume of correct, untestable by contemporaries details.
Yes. And secondly, there is a fundamental difference in genre intent. Spider-Man is presented by its creators, publishers, and readers as acknowledged fiction. Everyone agrees on the rules of the game.
But the Gospels don't do that.
No, the Gospels explicitly and repeatedly claim to be eyewitness history. The author of Luke opens his account by stating he investigated everything carefully from the beginning, interviewing eyewitnesses to provide a record of certainty.
And John explicitly states he's recording what he physically saw and touched.
Exactly. Now, you as a modern reader don't have to believe their claim, but we must acknowledge that historical documentation is the genre they are claiming, and when we apply the historical tests to that claim, they pass the test of having hard-to-fake, hyperspecific knowledge of the era.
Which brings us to the culture, because getting a map right is impressive, but map borders don't breathe. People do.
That's a great way to put it.
Getting the cultural DNA, the social friction, the local gossip right is infinitely harder to fake than a topographical map.
Oh, absolutely. The Gospels intimately know the social dynamics of first-century Palestine, and nothing screams authentic human history louder than a deeply ingrained, localized prejudice.
Yes. Let's talk about the prejudices, because they are presented as unquestioned facts of life in these texts. The Gospels constantly portray this dripping condescension that the people of Judea, the southern region around Jerusalem, had against the people of Galilee up in the north.
It's regional snobbery at its finest.
It's everywhere. You have a guy named Nathaniel in John's Gospel who hears about Jesus and literally sneers, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Or when the religious leaders in Jerusalem are arguing with Nicodemus, they try to shut him down by saying, "Are you also from Galilee? Search and see. No prophet arises out of Galilee." They're basically calling him an uneducated hick.
They are.
But my absolute favorite example is Peter during the trial of Jesus. Peter is hiding in the high priest's courtyard trying to blend in. A servant girl walks up to him and says, "Surely you two are one of them, for the way you talk gives you away."
They busted him on his accent.
They busted him because of his accent. It's so real.
And this is where we have to cross-reference with external historical sources again. Why would a Judean recognize a Galilean accent, and why would it be a point of mockery?
Right.
Well, the Babylonian Talmud, which is a massive central text of rabbinic Judaism compiled later, provides explicit historical validation of this exact prejudice.
Tell me about the Talmudic jokes, because the idea of first-century linguistic humor is fascinating.
It really is. The Talmud explicitly records that Galileans were notorious for dropping their guttural consonants. They wouldn't properly pronounce the Hebrew letters aleph and ayin.
So they mumbled.
Essentially, yes. To the highly educated aristocratic Judeans down in Jerusalem, the Galileans sounded sloppy, uneducated, and religiously lax because they couldn't even pronounce the Holy Scriptures correctly in the synagogue.
Wow.
There's this famous, somewhat hilarious story preserved in the Talmud about a Galilean man walking through a Judean market trying to buy something. He's yelling the word Amar.
Okay, Amor.
Right. And the Judeans openly mock him. They ask, "You foolish Galilean, what do you want? Do you want a donkey, which is chomor, to ride? Or wine shamar to drink? Or woolamar for clothing? Or a lamimar to slaughter?"
That is incredible.
Because he was dropping his consonants, the Judeans literally couldn't understand which of the four completely different words he was trying to say.
That is an amazing historical detail. It's a localized linguistic pun.
It is. And the crucial point for our investigation is that the Gospel of John, which was likely finalized decades later in the Greek-speaking city of Ephesus for an audience of non-Jews, doesn't bother to explain any of this.
Really? No exposition?
None. A Greek reader in Ephesus wouldn't inherently know why being from Galilee was a punchline, but John just records the prejudice casually, without exposition, because that was the lived reality of the memory he was recording. It's an unforced, deeply authentic cultural imprint.
Okay, let's pivot to the heavy stuff. Jewish law.
Oh, the legal codes, yes.
Because if I am trying to forge a document about a Jewish rabbi, and I am not intimately familiar with first-century Palestinian Judaism, I am going to walk right into a trap when it comes to the labyrinth of rabbinic law.
You'd get tangled up immediately.
But the texts show Jesus engaging in highly complex, accurate legal debates.
The incident in John chapter 7 is a prime example of this. Jesus gets into a fierce dispute with the religious leaders in Jerusalem because he healed a man on the Sabbath.
Right, and the Sabbath was the holiest day of the week, and Mosaic law strictly forbade any form of labor.
And healing was considered labor, so the leaders are furious.
And Jesus counters them with a legal argument. He basically says, look, you guys circumcise a male child on the Sabbath so that the law of Moses may not be broken. So why are you angry with me for making a whole man well on the Sabbath?
Now, to a modern reader, that just sounds like a clever rhetorical comeback.
Yeah, it sounds like a good singer.
But historians of Judaism recognize that Jesus is utilizing an actual, highly specific rabbinic legal mechanism here. In Jewish law, there was a well-known conflict between two divine commands.
A clash of laws.
Exactly. God commanded that the Sabbath be a day of absolute rest. But God also commanded in the Torah that a male child must be circumcised precisely on the 8th day of his life.
Right, so what happens if a baby boy is born on a Friday and his 8th day falls exactly on the next Saturday, the Sabbath? Which law wins?
Exactly the problem.
Okay.
And the Talmud preserves the exact rabbinic rulings regarding this clash of laws. The rabbis determined that a positive command, the requirement to circumcise, takes precedence over a negative command, the prohibition against working on the Sabbath.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, the act of circumcision legally overrides the Sabbath rest.
So Jesus is using their own established ruling?
Yes, and he is applying an interpretive principle called qual wahomer, which means arguing from the lesser to the greater.
Lesser to the great. He is arguing. If it is legally permissible to perform a minor surgical procedure on one part of a baby's body to fulfill the law on the Sabbath, how much more legally permissible is it to heal a man's entire body on the Sabbath?
That isn't just a generic God is love argument. That is a razor-sharp, culturally native legal defense.
It's incredibly sophisticated.
A Greek forger inventing a new religion from scratch wouldn't even know that the circumcision Sabbath loophole existed, let alone know how to weaponize it using first-century rabbinic debate tactics.
Precisely. And yet, sometimes their knowledge of the culture looks, at first glance, like a massive error.
Yes. Let's talk about the high priests, Annas and Caiaphas, because I'm reading through the Gospel of Luke and the Gospel of John, and both of them refer to Annas and Caiaphas as being the high priests, plural, simultaneously.
Right.
They say things like, during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. Now, even with a basic understanding of the Old Testament, you know that the high priesthood is a singular, lifetime appointment.
It is. When the high priest dies, the next guy takes over. There is only one. So I'm sitting here wondering, did the gospel writers just completely misunderstand the core leadership structure of their own religion? How do they make such an obvious, glaring mistake?
On the surface, it looks like a fatal error. How can two men hold a singular lifetime office at the exact same time?
Exact.
But when you dig into the historical context, it's not a theological mistake. It's a flawlessly accurate reflection of the messy reality of Roman political occupation.
Okay, how so?
Under Roman rule, the Roman prefects didn't care about Jewish biblical law regarding lifetime religious appointments. They viewed the high priest as a political puppet.
Right.
And if that puppet stepped out of line, Rome replaced him. The Roman procurator Valerius Gratus actually deposed Annas from the high priesthood. Eventually, Rome installed Caiaphas, who was Annas' son-in-law, into the office.
Okay, so Caiaphas is the official legal high priest according to Rome. Why do the Gospels still call Annas the high priest?
Because to the Jewish people, the Roman deposition was entirely illegitimate. According to God's law, Annas was still the rightful high priest.
Wow.
He retained immense informal power and influence, acting almost like a mafia don behind the scenes, pulling the strings of his son-in-law. Out of deep cultural respect and defiance of Rome, the Jewish populace continued to refer to Annas by his lifetime title.
So it's an act of cultural rebellion.
Exactly. And we actually see this exact cultural phenomenon confirmed by Josephus decades later. Josephus writes about a situation where a former high priest named Ananias was deposed, and Rome appointed a new high priest named Jesus, son of Damnas.
What does Josephus call them?
Josephus explicitly refers to both men as the high priest, simultaneously in his writings.
That completely flips the objection on its head. What looks like a mistake is actually proof of insider knowledge.
It's proof that they understood the political realities on the street level.
But I think my absolute favorite piece of evidence in this entire cultural section is the name statistics.
Oh, this is fantastic data.
This is just cold, hard, unfeeling data, and it is mind-blowing. Let's explain how scholars like Richard Bauckham actually figured this out.
The methodology here is vital. If we want to know what names were popular in first-century Palestine, we can't just guess. We need demographic data.
Right.
Bauckham relied heavily on a monumental lexicon compiled by an Israeli scholar named Tal Ilan. She cataloged every known Jewish name from Palestine between 330 BC and 200 AD.
But where do they find these names? It's not like they had digital census records.
No, they used a variety of hard historical sources. They used the writings of Josephus, ancient tax receipts, legal contracts preserved in the desert, but the most crucial source of data comes from ossuaries.
Let's define that for the listener. What exactly is an ossuary?
An ossuary is a limestone bone box. During a very specific window of history in Jerusalem, roughly from 20 BC up until the city's destruction in 70 AD, the Jewish burial practice was unique.
How did it work?
They would lay a body in a cave tomb until the flesh decayed, which usually took about a year. Then the family would return, gather the bones, and place them into a carved limestone box, an ossuary.
Okay.
And families would often scratch the name of the deceased onto the side of the box. Thousands of these have been discovered in burial caves around Jerusalem.
So it's essentially a massive stone database of first-century census data.
Exactly. It gives us a pristine statistical snapshot of the actual names of the people walking the streets of Jerusalem during the exact time of Jesus.
And what Bauckham and others discovered is that the Jewish naming culture in Palestine was incredibly concentrated.
Highly concentrated. A huge percentage of the population shared a very small pool of names.
Let's look at the numbers. Simon was the #1 most popular male name in the culture, followed closely by Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, and John.
Yep.
For women, the name Mary or Miriam was overwhelmingly the most popular, followed by Salome.
Now, compare that massive database of physical evidence to the texts of the New Testament. In the Gospels and the book of Acts, what is the most common male name? Simon.
Crazy.
What is the most common female name? Mary. But it goes much deeper than just the top spots. If you take the top 9 most popular male names from the historical, ossuary, and document data, they account for approximately 41.5% of the total male population of Palestine.
So nearly half the guys in the country share just 9 names.
Yes. Now look at the Gospels and Acts. Those exact same top 9 names account for 40.3% of the Jewish males mentioned in the texts.
Wow.
It is a near-perfect statistical match. The frequency distribution of names in the New Testament flawlessly mirrors the actual demographic reality of the time.
And we know this is a specifically localized phenomenon, right? Because Jewish communities living in other parts of the Roman Empire had completely different naming trends.
Oh, absolutely. If you look at the records of Jewish communities living down in Egypt during the same era, their names were heavily influenced by the local culture.
So they weren't all named Simon and Mary.
No, a name like Sabbathias or Dositheus was massively popular among Egyptian Jews, but almost non-existent in Palestine. The Gospel writers don't use Egyptian Jewish names. They use Palestinian Jewish names in the exact correct mathematical proportions.
But as someone who thinks about storytelling, here's the part that fascinates me. Disambiguators.
Yes.
If you are in a culture where 20% of the women are named Mary and a massive chunk of the men are named Simon, how do you tell each other apart in conversation?
You use disambiguators. These are descriptive qualifiers attached to a name. Since they didn't have formalized modern surnames, they would use a hometown, a father's name, or a distinct physical or occupational trait.
It's the same thing we do today. If you have 3 kids named Matt in your 3rd grade classroom, the teacher automatically starts calling them Matt Smith, Matt Jones, and Tall Matt.
It's an organic social necessity. And the Gospels apply these disambiguators with perfect statistical logic. When a character has a name that we know from the ossuaries was highly popular, the Gospel writers almost always attach a disambiguator.
So we don't just read about Simon.
Right. We read about Simon Peter, Simon the Zealot, Simon the Leper, Simon of Cyrene. We don't just read about Mary. We have Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, Mary of Bethany.
But wait, what if the character has a rare name?
This is the genius of the text's authenticity. If a disciple has a name that was statistically rare in the general population, the Gospel writers almost never use a disambiguator.
So disciples like Bartholomew, Thaddeus, or Philip.
They're usually just called by their first name. Why? Because in any given crowd in Galilee, they were probably the only Bartholomew there. They didn't need a qualifier.
That makes total sense.
This pattern completely aligns with everyday cultural practice. If you contrast this with the fake, non-canonical Gnostic Gospels written centuries later like the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Thomas, those writers completely fail the naming test.
How so? Do they just guess wrong?
They either just casually use the name Mary without specifying which one, ignoring the confusion it would cause, or they invent totally exotic, bizarre, mystical names like Yeldabaoth. that don't fit any historical Jewish demographic pattern whatsoever.
Yaldabaoth. Yeah, that doesn't sound like a local fisherman.
No, it doesn't. The canonical Gospels, however, passed the demographic data test with flying colors.
Okay, so let's take a breath and look at what we have so far. We have the political borders right, the buried architecture right, the cultural prejudices right, the complex rabbinic legal mechanisms right, and the exact mathematical distribution of first names right.
It's an impressive list.
It is, but all of that is looking at the texts in isolation compared to the outside world. If we are really treating these as independent eyewitness testimonies, we have to look at how these four separate documents interact with each other.
Right, if four people genuinely witness the same events, their stories should interlock.
Exactly. Which brings us to...
What's fascinating here is this concept called undesigned coincidences.
Yes. Let's get into this.
This was an argument originally championed in the 19th century by a scholar named J.J. Blunt, and it's been revitalized beautifully in recent years by philosopher Lydia McGrew.
What's the foundational idea?
The idea is that when you have independent witnesses describing a real historical event, their accounts naturally and accidentally interlock in ways neither witness could have possibly intended or planned.
Because they're seeing the same reality.
Yes. They are describing the exact same three-dimensional reality, but from entirely different vantage points.
I want to make sure you, the listener, can really visualize this concept. So let's use a modern analogy. Imagine you have two friends, and they both went to the exact same disastrous dinner party last weekend.
Okay, disastrous dinner party.
Yeah. On Monday, you run into friend A. He says, man, the party was completely ruined. Out of nowhere, John just violently spilled his entire glass of red wine all over the host's white rug.
A classic disaster.
Right. Now on Wednesday, you run into friend B. You ask about the party. Friend B never even mentions the spilled wine. Instead, friend B says, it was a crazy night. The host's massive golden retriever got spooked and came sprinting at full speed under the dinner table.
I see where this is going.
Right. You, as the listener, take those two independent statements and put them together. And suddenly, the invisible truth reveals itself. The dog running under the table bumped John's leg, which caused him to spill the wine.
Friend A gave you the effect. Friend B gave you the cause.
Exactly. They didn't call each other to coordinate their stories. They just witnessed the same chaotic moment, and their memories accidentally interlocked to give you the full picture.
That is a brilliant analogy, and it is exactly what we see happening across the four Gospels over and over again. Let's look at one of the most famous examples of an undesigned coincidence. The story of Philip and the bread.
Ooh, I love this one.
In the Gospel of John, chapter 6, Jesus is standing on a hillside, and a massive crowd of 5,000 people approaches him. He knows he needs to feed them.
Okay.
The text says that Jesus turns specifically to the disciple Philip and asks him, "Where are we to buy bread so that these may eat?"
And as a reader, if you are paying attention, you should be asking, why in the world is he asking Philip?
Right. Philip is not part of the inner circle. That's Peter, James, and John.
He's not the treasurer either. We know that was Judas.
Exactly. Philip is a relatively minor background disciple. John's gospel offers no geographical context for why Philip is singled out. John just says Jesus asked him to test him. It's a dangling mystery.
It's a mystery until you leave John's gospel and read the Gospel of Luke.
Yes. In Luke chapter 9, Luke tells the story of the feeding of the 5,000. Now, Luke doesn't mention Jesus asking Philip anything, but Luke does casually mention the location.
He notes that this massive miracle took place near a town called Bethsaida.
Okay, so we have a location from Luke, Bethsaida.
Right.
Now, go way back to the beginning of the Gospel of John, chapter 1. John is describing the very first week Jesus is calling his disciples. In passing, John mentions where a few of them grew up. He notes, casually, that Philip was from Bethsaida.
Wait, really?
Yes. He mentions it again in chapter 12 in a totally unrelated story where some Greeks are looking for Philip, referring to him as Philip from Bethsaida in Galilee.
Oh, wow. When you put the pieces together, it perfectly resolves the mystery. Luke tells us the miracle happened on a hillside near Bethsaida. John tells us that Philip's hometown is Bethsaida.
Jesus turned to Philip and asked where to buy bread because Jesus was essentially saying, "Hey, Philip, you're the local guy here. Where's the closest bakery or market in this town?"
This is just so cool. And the most important point here is the lack of coordination, right?
Exactly. John doesn't tell us where the feeding took place. Luke supplies that detail. Luke doesn't tell us why Philip was singled out. John's gospel supplies that.
If John had intentionally invented the question about Philip just to fit Luke's location, John would have explicitly mentioned the location himself to make sure the reader got the connection.
And if Luke had invented the location of Bethsaida to fit John's story about Philip, Luke would have mentioned Philip. But neither author does that. They leave the halves of the puzzle in separate books. It is an invisible, accidental interlock. It is the hallmark of truth.
That is genuinely incredible. It feels so organic. Let's look at another one involving the exact same event, the green grass and Passover.
Ah, another great one.
In Mark's Gospel, he mentions a tiny visual detail about the feeding of the 5,000. He says that Jesus commanded the crowd to sit down on the green grass. Meanwhile, John's Gospel doesn't mention the color of the grass, but John drops a chronological marker noting that the Jewish festival of the Passover was near.
And if we understand the climate of the region, we see another perfect interlock. The land of Galilee is incredibly arid for most of the year.
Yeah, in the summer, autumn, and winter, the hillsides are completely brown, scorched, and barren.
The grass in Galilee is only vibrant and green for a very short window during the spring rains.
And Passover is a spring festival.
Precisely. Mark gives us the vivid visual memory of the green grass, but he doesn't tell us the time of year. John gives us the chronological time of year, but he doesn't mention the grass.
They just dovetail perfectly.
Without either author realizing they're supporting the other, simply because they are both describing an event that actually took place in the spring.
Okay, I see how compelling that is, but I have to bring up an objection here. If I'm a skeptic listening to this, I'm thinking about the synoptic copying theory.
Okay, let's address that.
We know that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the synoptic gospels, share a lot of similar material. Most scholars believe Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source.
Yes, that's the standard view.
So couldn't these coincidences just be the result of Matthew and Luke literally having a copy of Mark's scroll open on their desks and just copying his homework?
It's a very fair question, and it's why the study of undesigned coincidences specifically isolates the unshared material. The power of the argument relies entirely on the parts of the stories the authors did not copy from each other.
Oh, I see.
Let's look at the story of Herod and John the Baptist to illustrate this. Both Matthew and Mark record the political paranoia of Herod Antipas. They both note that when Herod heard about the miracles Jesus was doing, Herod was terrified that Jesus was actually John the Baptist risen from the dead.
Right.
But Matthew adds a very strange, specific detail that Mark doesn't have. Matthew says that Herod expressed this fear to his servants.
Which, if you think about it, is a really weird detail for a disciple of Jesus to know. Herod is a paranoid, cutthroat, Roman-appointed ruler. How would a group of fishermen and tax collectors know what Herod was whispering to his private household staff behind closed doors in the palace?
It's a detail that demands an explanation, but Matthew never provides one. He just states it as fact. However, if we go over to the Gospel of Luke, we find the missing piece.
What does Luke say?
In Luke chapter 8, Luke provides a brief list of the wealthy women who were traveling with Jesus and supporting his ministry financially. Luke casually mentions a woman named Mary Magdalene, and then he mentions a woman named Joanna.
Okay, Joanna.
And how does Luke describe Joanna? He identifies her as the wife of Chuza, who was Herod's household manager.
Wait. Joanna's husband manages Herod's palace staff. Does that mean Joanna is the leak?
The evidence points exactly to that conclusion. Joanna had direct, intimate access to the private conversations happening among Herod's highest-ranking household servants. She hears what Herod is terrified of, and she brings that information back to the disciples.
That is amazing.
And notice how the copying theory fails here. Matthew doesn't mention Joanna at all. Luke doesn't mention Herod's fearful remark to his servants at all. The interlock relies on material that is entirely independent and unshared.
You cannot explain these coincidences away through literary copying because they are constantly supplying the missing halves of each other's sentences.
Exactly.
I love that. It gives the text such a three-dimensional feel, which transitions us perfectly into discussing the actual texture of human memory. Because true, authentic eyewitness testimony has a very specific feel to it.
It does. It's not perfectly polished.
Right. It contains these weird, random, unnecessary details that human memory just clings to for no apparent reason. Scholars refer to this as the Goldilocks zone of detail.
It's a great term for it. Think about modern realistic fiction. When a novelist is trained to write, they are taught to provide a consistent, even level of sensory detail throughout the book to maintain the atmosphere. The whole book feels evenly textured.
But real human memory doesn't operate like a novel. It's wildly uneven.
Completely uneven.
I think everyone listening can relate to this. If you try to recall a highly emotional memory from high school, you probably don't remember the exact dialogue, and you might not remember what day of the week it was.
Right.
But you vividly remember the weird, specific geometric pattern on the carpet of the room you were standing in, or the exact song playing faintly on the radio. It's uneven clarity.
Precisely. And the Gospels reflect this exact unevenness of authentic memory. They include vivid details that add absolutely zero theological or narrative value to the story.
I have a list of these seemingly pointless details right here. In the Gospel of Mark, Jesus and the disciples are caught in a massive storm on the Sea of Galilee. Jesus is asleep. But Mark is the only writer who specifically notes that Jesus was sleeping on a cushion in the stern of the boat.
Or mention the cushion.
Exactly. It doesn't make the miracle of calming the storm any better. Or, in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. Luke, who is known as a physician, specifically notes that it was the man's right hand.
The theology of the healing is identical whether it's the left or the right, but the memory isolated the right hand.
But my absolute favorite example of this is in John chapter 21. After the resurrection, the disciples are out on a boat fishing. Jesus calls to them from the shore. Peter, who had taken his outer coat off to do the hard labor of hauling nets, realizes it's Jesus.
Oh, this is such a good one.
So what does Peter do? He puts his heavy outer coat on and then throws himself into the water to swim to the shore.
It's delightfully odd, isn't it? From a practical standpoint, why would anyone put on more heavy clothing before diving into a lake to swim?
It makes no sense.
It doesn't make practical sense, but it makes profound cultural and psychological sense. In the Jewish culture of that era, to be stripped down to your undergarments for manual labor was considered a state of nakedness.
Right.
Peter, in a moment of sheer awe and reverence, realizes he is about to stand before his resurrected Lord. His immediate cultural instinct is to cover himself, to show respect, even if it means swimming awkwardly in a heavy coat.
But notice that the author, John, doesn't pause the narrative to explain Peter's internal thought process. He doesn't offer a cultural exposition on modesty.
No. He just vividly remembers the bizarre visual of Peter frantically throwing his coat on before splashing into the lake, and he writes it down. Inventors of mythological fairy tales don't produce awkward, pointless details like that. Eyewitnesses do.
And this authentic texture extends to leaving threads completely dangling. In modern storytelling, a writer wants to wrap up every plot point. If you introduce a loaded gun in Act 1, it has to go off in Act 3.
But the Gospels are littered with unexplained allusions.
For instance, Mark says that Jesus gave the brothers James and John a specific nickname, Boanerges, which translates to sons of thunder.
Such a cool nickname.
It is. But Mark never explains why she called them that. Did they have terrible, booming tempers? Was it an inside joke about how loud they snored? We have no idea.
We don't know. Or in Luke chapter 13, some people come up to Jesus and ask him about a tragedy involving some Galileans whose blood the Roman governor Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices.
That is a perfect example of an unexplained historical allusion. Luke is writing to a Greek-speaking audience, explicitly addressing a patron named Theophilus.
Right. That distant audience would likely have absolutely no idea what that hyper-local tragic event in the Jerusalem temple was. We don't even have a record of this specific slaughter in Josephus' histories.
But Luke doesn't stop to explain the political context.
He doesn't use it to make a larger point about Rome brutality. He just drops the reference in because he is faithfully recording the actual conversation Jesus had on that specific day.
A fabricator wants to be understood by their audience.
Exactly. Leaving a confusing, hyper-specific reference dangling is the hallmark of someone simply acting as a recording device for what was actually said.
Okay, but I'm going to internalize the skeptic's perspective again here. If I call my boss to lie about why I'm late for work, I don't just say, my car broke down.
What do you say?
I say, my 1998 Honda Civic blew its front left tire on Interstate 95 because I hit a massive pothole in the right lane.
Highly specific.
Right. Liars know that adding specific details makes a lie sound believable. So couldn't all these cushions and coats and right hands just be the mark of really clever con artists?
It's a necessary objection to address. Yes, liars absolutely add details, but we have to analyze the function of the details a liar adds. A liar adds strategic details to build their own credibility or to solidify their alibi. What a liar does not do is add unexplained illusions that confuse their target audience.
They don't introduce a cool nickname like Sons of Thunder and then completely forget to tell the awesome story of how they got it.
Exactly. Furthermore, a liar cannot add details that accidentally interlock with an independent document they've never seen, like the green grass and the Passover.
Right, that would be impossible.
A few unnecessary details could be brushed off as clever literary embellishment. But hundreds of them, distributed randomly across 4 different documents, constantly confirmed by external archaeology and interlocking with each other. The sheer cognitive load of orchestrating that kind of forgery is impossible.
Which brings us to a fascinating juncture. We have 4 independent memories that interlock, but if they are truly independent human memories, shouldn't they disagree sometimes?
They absolutely should.
If you and I see a car crash, our police reports aren't going to be identical. The answer regarding the Gospels is yes, they absolutely should disagree on the margins, and they do.
And this is where we have to look at the concept of reconcilable variation. To understand this, it's incredibly helpful to bring in the perspective of J. Warner Wallace, who's a veteran cold case homicide detective.
Oh, I've read his stuff.
He took the exact same analytical framework he uses to evaluate eyewitness testimony in murder trials and applied it to the Gospels. He points out a foundational rule of criminal investigation. If 4 witnesses come into the police precinct and give the exact same story, word for word, matching flawlessly on every single minor detail, what does the detective do?
He arrests them for collusion because human beings don't process reality like video cameras. If their stories match perfectly, it means they stood in the parking lot before they came in and rehearsed their lie.
Exactly. Authentic human testimony always features what the 19th century legal scholar Thomas Starkey called substantial truth under circumstantial variety.
Substantial truth under circumstantial variety. I like that.
Real witnesses agree on the core, undeniable event, but they vary wildly on the incidentals, depending on their physical vantage point, what they personally found important, or simply the quirks of their memory.
So let's tackle one of these apparent contradictions in the text, because critics love to point these out. Let's look at the blind men of Jericho.
Okay, Matthew versus Mark and Luke.
Right. In Matthew's gospel, it says that as Jesus was leaving the city of Jericho, he was approached by 2 blind men, and he healed them both. But if you read Mark and Luke, they both report that he healed 1 blind man. Mark even gives us his name, Bartimaeus.
Yes.
So is this a contradiction? Did Matthew just invent an extra miracle to make Jesus look more powerful?
It is a difference in completeness, not a logical contradiction. Think about the fundamental logic of the event. If 2 blind men were healed, then one was certainly healed.
That's true.
None of the gospel writers use exclusionary language. Mark and Luke do not write, Jesus healed 1 and only 1 blind man. They're simply focusing their narrative on the specific individual whose name was remembered by the early Christian community, Bartimaeus.
Why do they remember his name?
Likely because, as the text suggests, he followed Jesus and became a known member of the early church, whereas the other man may have just gone home. Matthew, on the other hand, frequently focuses on the sheer numerical completeness of Jesus' miracles, so he mentions both men. They vary in their focus, but the core historical event, Jesus healing the blind at Jericho, remains rock solid.
Let's look at another one involving numbers and time, because those are always tricky. The timing of the transfiguration.
Okay.
Jesus takes Peter, James, and John up a mountain, and he is transfigured in front of them in blinding light. In Mark's gospel, he says this event happened 6 days after a specific conversation Jesus had with the disciples.
Right.
But in Luke's gospel, he says the event happened about 8 days after the conversation. So someone's math is wrong, right? 6 does not equal 8.
This is a beautiful example of how understanding ancient conventions resolves modern confusion. Historians like Colin Heimer point out that this discrepancy is almost certainly the difference between exclusive and inclusive counting.
Break that down for us. How does inclusive counting work?
In the modern Western world, we usually use exclusive counting. If today is Monday and I say I will see you in exactly 1 week, next Monday, I am counting the 7 intervening days.
Sure.
But in the ancient world, many cultures, including the Romans and often the Jews, used inclusive counting. They counted the day you are currently on as day 1, and the day the event happens as the final day.
Oh, I see.
So let's look at the timeline.
Yeah.
Jesus has a conversation on a Monday. He goes up the mountain the following Monday. Mark is using exclusive counting. He only counts the 6 full days in between Tuesday through Sunday.
And Luke?
Luke is using inclusive counting. He counts the first Monday as day 1, the 6 days in between, and the final Monday as day 8.
That makes perfect sense. It's the exact same span of time, just expressed through different cultural idioms.
And look even closer at Luke's specific phrasing. He writes, about 8 days.
Oh, about.
Yes. If Luke's goal was just to blindly copy Mark's gospel to ensure his story matched, he would just written 6 days. But Luke is relying on his own independent sources. Perhaps he's interviewing Peter years later, and Peter hesitantly recalls it was about a week later, maybe 8 days.
Luke faithfully preserves that hesitant about.
Exactly. He preserves his sources in precision. That variation proves his independence as an investigator.
Which brings us to the broader objection critics raise. The idea that variations equal contradictions, and therefore the texts are hopelessly corrupted and unreliable.
This is where historians most apply what is known as the asymmetry test. When historians look at ancient secular history, they deal with variations all the time.
Like what?
Take the assassination of Julius Caesar. We have multiple historical accounts from revered Roman historians like Plutarch, Suetonius, and Appian. Their accounts of the assassination vary wildly in the minor details: who struck first, what Caesar's exact final words were, where people were standing.
But no serious mainstream historian throws out Plutarch's entire history just because he differs from Suetonius on an incidental detail.
They understand that variation is the hallmark of multiple sources. Yet, critics often apply a hyper-skeptical, selectively brutal standard to the Gospels that they would never dream of applying to secular history.
It's a double standard.
It is.
Uh-huh.
Furthermore, the critics trap themselves in a logical paradox. They demand that the Gospels have zero variations, but simultaneously they claim that the Gospel writers just lazily copied each other.
You cannot hold both positions.
You can't. The variations are the absolute proof that they did not simply copy each other.
Yeah.
They are independent witnesses describing the same reality.
All right, I want to transition into the psychology of the text. We spent a lot of time on maps, timelines, and legal codes, but what about the human element?
The characterizations.
Yes. Do the people in these texts act like real, complex, three-dimensional human beings? Because if this is a manufactured religious myth, we should expect to see flat, one-dimensional caricatures. The holy hero, the evil villain, the perfect sidekicks.
But we don't see that.
Instead, we see astonishingly unified, complex supporting personalities across entirely independent sources. Let's talk about my favorite guy in the text, Peter.
Peter is an absolute masterpiece of character consistency. If you read across all 4 Gospels, he is painted with the exact same highly specific psychological profile.
He is doubly warm-hearted, fiercely loyal, wildly impulsive, often obnoxiously loud, and frequently overconfident in his own abilities.
He is the ultimate act first, think later guy.
I mean, look at his track record. In Matthew, he sees Jesus walking on the water, and his immediate impulsive reaction is to demand to walk on the water too. Then he gets out there, realizes he's in a hurricane, panics, and sinks.
Very on brand for him.
Right. In Mark, during that transfiguration on the mountain, he is terrified and has absolutely no idea what to say, so his coping mechanism is to just start rambling about building tents for everyone.
Which is such a human reaction to stress.
Exactly. In John, when the soldiers come to arrest Jesus, Peter is the guy who draws a sword, swings wildly, and chops off a servant's ear. He boasts loudly that he will die before he ever abandons Jesus, and then hours later, he cowardly denies knowing him 3 times to a servant girl.
He is a massive, walking mess of contradictions. But it is a profoundly human mess.
And this exact chaotic personality profile is drawn by all 4 independent authors, often in unique stories that the other writers don't even include.
We see that exact same psychological consistency with 2 female figures in the text, Mary and Martha.
Oh, yes, the sisters.
In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, Jesus visits their home in the village of Bethany.
Yeah.
Luke sketches a very brief, vivid portrait of their dynamics. Martha is highly active, bustling around the house, stressed out and frustrated that she's doing all the serving.
And Mary is contemplative, quiet, and chooses to sit on the floor at Jesus' feet to listen to him teach.
Now, fast forward to the Gospel of John, chapters 11 and 12. John does not record the dinner party story that Luke tells. John is telling totally different narratives about the sickness and raising of their brother Lazarus and a later anointing at a dinner.
But their baseline personalities are completely, unmistakably identical.
Yes. When Jesus arrives in Bethany after Lazarus has already died, how do the sisters react? It is Martha, the active one, who marches straight out of the house, meets Jesus on the road, and demands theological answers from him.
And where is Mary?
She stays back in the house, overwhelmed by grief, until she is called. When she finally sees Jesus, she immediately falls weeping at his feet.
And then in the next chapter?
During a dinner, it is Martha who is once again doing the serving, and it is Mary who takes incredibly expensive perfume and quietly, reverently anoints Jesus' feet.
Luke and John are not coordinating their character sheets like novelists. They are independently reporting on real, living, breathing women whose actual ingrained personalities naturally shine through every situation they are placed in.
Which naturally brings us to the most scrutinized figure in all of human history, Jesus himself.
When you read the Gospels, the portrait of Jesus is so unique. He's not just a generic, serene, holy man dispensing fortune cookie wisdom. He has a very specific, sharp edge to his personality. He has this biting wit, and he constantly uses pointed reversals to expose hypocrisy.
The tithing mint and dill rebuke is a perfect example of his wit. In Matthew 23, Jesus is calling out the religious hypocrisy of the Pharisees. He points out that they're obsessively, meticulously tithing tiny, lightweight herbs from their gardens, mint, dill, and cumin.
But while they are doing that, they are completely neglecting the weightier matters of God's law, like justice, mercy, and faithfulness.
It is a brilliant, devastating play on words about physical weight versus moral weight, and it is grounded in actual historical rabbinic practices of meticulously weighing tiny seeds, which is confirmed by the Talmud.
He is also the absolute master of the impromptu object lesson.
Yeah.
He never gives a prepackaged three-point lecture. He uses whatever is physically in the room with him to make his point. The disciples are arguing about who is the greatest. He grabs a toddler walking by, pulls the kid into the center of the room, and says, "Unless you become like this child, you'll never enter the kingdom."
A woman asks for a drink at a local well. He pivots the conversation to talk about living water that quenches spiritual thirst. He physically washes their dirty feet to demonstrate servant leadership.
And underneath all of that teaching, there is this deep, pervasive, agonizing loneliness to him. He constantly tries to tell his friends he is going to be killed, and they never understand him. He prays in absolute agony alone in the Garden of Gethsemane, while his three best friends keep falling asleep feet away from him.
He cries out in profound isolation from the cross. It is an incredibly raw, unsentimental portrait. C.S. Lewis astutely observed that the purely, sweetly attractive human Jesus, who just wanders around being nice to everyone, is entirely a modern invention.
The Jesus we actually find in the text of the Gospels is deeply compassionate, yes, but he is also abrasive, uncompromising, terrifying at times, and profoundly isolated.
And this complex, challenging portrait pervades all four documents.
But here comes the major theological objection from critics. They say, sure, the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they present a human Jesus, a great rabbi. But the Gospel of John was written way later, and John basically invented a divine Jesus to start a new, elevated theology. John is the one who makes Jesus into God.
I hear that all the time.
How does the historical evidence counter that claim?
By simply reading the texts themselves, because the claim completely collapses under scrutiny. The idea that Jesus only claims to be divine in the Gospel of John is a myth. The Jesus of the Synoptic Gospels is constantly, aggressively claiming divine prerogatives.
Give us an example.
Look at Mark chapter 2. A paralyzed man is lowered through a roof. Before Jesus heals his legs, Jesus tells the man, "Your sins are forgiven."
Oh, right.
The religious leaders in the room immediately recognize this as a massive claim to deity. They say to themselves, who can forgive sins but God alone? They understand exactly what Jesus is implying.
Jesus doesn't correct them and say, no, I'm just a prophet.
No, he proves he has the divine authority to forgive sins by healing the man's paralysis.
Or look at his trial before the high priest in Mark 14. The priest asks him point blank if he is the Messiah. And Jesus says, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven.
And we have to understand the context of that phrase. Son of Man riding on the clouds is not just a poetic metaphor. It is a direct, unmistakable reference to the apocalyptic vision in the book of Daniel, chapter 7.
Where the figure is worshipped.
Exactly. In that vision, a divine figure rides the clouds to the throne of the Ancient of Days and is given eternal worship and dominion over all the earth. When Jesus claims that title for himself, the high priest tears his clothes and declares it blasphemy, because Jesus is claiming equality with God.
Jesus also routinely accepts physical worship in the Gospel of Matthew, something that no Jewish prophet or angel ever allows.
The Jesus of the Synoptics acts as God. The Jesus of John acts as God. There is no evolutionary leap from a purely human, moralistic rabbi in the year 50 to a divine, cosmic figure in the year 90. The massive claims to deity are unified from the very earliest sources.
Furthermore, as we established in the geography section earlier, John's Gospel contains the most precise, accurate, pre-AD 70 geographical and architectural history of all four texts.
Yes. The critical idea that John is just some later, untethered mystical fairy tale directly contradicts the hard archaeological data of his historical accuracy.
Okay, we are entering the final stretch here. We have spent this deep dive looking at the granular microscopic evidence, the pools, the porticos, the name demographics, the rabbinic laws, the undesigned coincidences, the inclusive counting.
It's a lot to process.
It is. But now we have to pull the camera all the way back. We have to look at the massive philosophical objections that skeptics raise against this entire enterprise. The biggest one, objection #7, is the anti-supernatural bias. A skeptical listener might say, look, everything you've said about the history is fascinating. But at the end of the day, these texts contain claims of literal miracles. People walking on water, feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread, a man physically rising from the dead. Doesn't modern enlightened history dictate that we have to throw these documents out automatically simply because miracles break the laws of physics?
It is arguably the most common barrier for modern readers. But from a strict philosophical and historical standpoint, dismissing a historical text purely because it contains reports of the supernatural is a deeply flawed circular argument.
How so?
The argument basically goes like this. Miracles cannot happen. Therefore, any historical report of a miracle must be false. That is an a priori rejection.
Meaning you've already made up your mind.
Right. A priori means you are establishing your conclusion before you even look at the evidence. It begs the question. If we are acting as genuine, unbiased historians, investigating whether something extraordinary actually happened in space and time, we cannot rule out the possibility of the extraordinary before we even open the file. We have to follow the evidence where it leads.
And when you look at the evidence, something really fascinating emerges about the hostile witnesses of the 1st and 2nd centuries, the enemies of the early Christian movement.
This is a crucial, often overlooked historical data point.
Tell us about it.
When we look at the rabbinic writings in the Talmud, or the writings of the prominent pagan critic Celsus in the 2nd century, these were men who deeply despised Jesus and wanted to crush the Christian movement.
They weren't fans.
Not at all. But when they wrote about Jesus, they didn't say he was just a normal guy who gave nice speeches about loving your neighbor and his followers invented all this magic stuff later.
Oh, they fully admitted that Jesus performed highly unusual, inexplicable, extraordinary feats. They conceded the reality of the events.
Exactly.
So how do they explain it away?
They disputed the source of his power. The Talmud claims Jesus was a sorcerer who led Israel astray. Celsus claimed Jesus went to Egypt, learned dark Egyptian magic, and came back to perform tricks to make people think he was a god.
Do you see the significance of that? The earliest, most hostile sources available acknowledge the extraordinary supernatural nature of his life.
They didn't deny the miracles happened. They just attributed them to demonic forces or dark magic. When both the friends and the enemies of a historical figure agree that he did things that defied natural explanation, the historian has to take that seriously.
Okay, what about the ultimate nuclear skeptical claim, objection #8, the mythicist theory? You see this all over the internet.
Ah, yes.
The claim is Jesus never existed at all. The whole thing is just a complete fabrication, an ancient copy-paste job of older pagan dying and rising gods like Horus, Osiris, or Mithras.
It's very popular in YouTube documentaries and Reddit threads, but among actual professional historians of antiquity, it is a massive fringe view. Yes. And I don't just mean Christian historians. I mean historians of all backgrounds, secular, agnostic, atheist, Jewish. Look at Dr. Bart Ehrman, who is perhaps the most prominent agnostic New Testament scholar in the world today.
What does he say?
Ehrman states emphatically in print that the historical existence of Jesus of Nazareth is a secure, undeniable historical fact.
Why are secular historians so universally sure he existed if the texts have miracles in them?
Because of the mountain of mundane evidence we've just spent this entire deep dive unpacking. Mythological figures don't operate like this.
Right. Mythological gods don't have hometowns with identifiable, mocked local accents.
They don't interact with perfectly sequenced, historically verifiable Roman tetrarchs like Lysanias and Philip. They aren't anchored to specific, archaeologically verifiable municipal water structures like the Pool of Bethesda that were destroyed decades later.
Furthermore, Jesus is documented by a massive convergence of entirely non-Christian sources within decades of his execution.
You have the Roman historian Tacitus documenting his crucifixion under Pilate. You have the Jewish historian Josephus writing about him. You have the Roman governor Pliny the Younger writing to the Emperor Trajan about the early Christians singing hymns to Christ as to a god.
The sheer density of mundane, verifiable historical detail in the Gospels is fundamentally structurally incompatible with the genre of ancient mythology.
Yeah, mythological gods live in a vague, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. Jesus lives in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, when Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea and Herod was tetrarch of Galilee.
It's a completely different genre of reality.
Precisely. They are grounded in the grit and dirt of real human history.
Which brings us to our final thought, the cumulative case. We have journeyed through an immense amount of material today, and I want to summarize the core of what the historical evidence is arguing.
The case for the reliability of the Gospels does not rest on just one cool archaeological find.
It's not just the Abila inscription proving Lysanias existed. It's not just the pool of Siloam being dug up by sewer workers. It is the overwhelming, massive convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence.
Think about the impossible task of a hypothetical first-century forger trying to fake these documents. If a forger somehow miraculously faked the complex political geography of Roman Judea without access to a library, did they also magically guess the correct, hyper-localized statistical frequency of Jewish names in Palestine versus Egypt?
Did they also intentionally invent the brilliant, invisible, undesigned coincidences across independent documents, placing Philip in Bethsaida so Jesus could ask him where the bakery was?
Did they purposefully leave unexplained historical allusions dangling
Right.
and somehow successfully maintain a deeply unified, complex psychological profile of a chaotic man like Peter across 4 separate texts?
The math of it all being a coordinated fake is staggering. It requires a level of literary genius, global coordination, and historical prescience that simply did not exist in the first century world.
The implication here is profound. If these writers were this incredibly flawlessly accurate about the testable, mundane details of life, the 5 porticos of a pool, the exact price of a temple tax, the direction water flows in a wadi, the specific names of local politicians, it forces us to reconsider how we view them.
If they have proven themselves to be completely, painstakingly reliable on the things we can test with archaeology and demographic history, it demands that we take their untestable claims with profound seriousness. They have earned the right to be heard on the major claims.
I couldn't agree more.
So, what does this all mean for you listening right now? I want to leave you with a provocative thought, circling back to how we opened this deep dive. Imagine you are sitting on a jury in a courtroom. A major crime has been committed.
A witness takes the stand.
Right. Before they even get to the core of what they saw happen, they begin to describe the room where the event took place. And they are flawlessly, impossibly accurate. They know the exact architectural layout of the room. They know the specific time on the clock on the wall.
They know the weather outside the window.
They can perfectly mimic the exact regional accents of the people standing in the hallway. They know the exact brand of the drinks sitting on the table. Every single mundane detail they provide is painstakingly corroborated by external evidence, by forensic archaeology, and by independent witnesses who walked into the room from different doors.
If a witness proves to be that relentlessly, flawlessly accurate about the reality of the room, how much weight do you give their testimony about what actually happened inside that room?
These ancient sources aren't asking to be put in a safe, comfortable, unverifiable story box. They're asking to be treated as rigorous historical testimonies. The X-ray is clear. The room has been verified. The only question left is, what do you do with the evidence? Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep digging, and we will see you next time.